All right, we're in record mode right now, so let's go ahead and get started. Confined space awareness. Like I said before, this class is primarily to make you aware of the hazards associated in confined space emergencies. And with that awareness, it'll teach you things that you can do as a engine company arriving on scene to a confined space emergency. Things that you can do without making entry. And we're trying to make you aware of the hazards associated in regards to emergencies that occur around confined spaces. And we already did the instructions pretty much. Introduction, we covered that. Confined spaces can be found in many industrial facilities and highlighter going, many industrial facilities, agricultural facilities, municipal utility systems, and construction sites. On the west side of town, we're primarily residential communities. In the east side of town, East Manatee's area, seeing they're with us today, is primary residential with some light industrial. So we're going to probably run into problems with municipal utility systems, and that could be a county employees, it could be private contractors, it could be a number of people that will be working within the utility systems. And primarily what we're talking about utility systems, we're talking about storm drains and sewer systems, which are basically two separate systems. So that's where we more than likely will be called to a confined space emergency. Southern Manatee is probably looking at industrial facilities. They have a lot of light to heavier industry. East Manatee, you might have agricultural facilities out east. There's mines and things like that where they could be doing maintenance on confined space locations. All right, confined space operations are regulated by OSHA 1910-146, and everybody will say, well, we're not an OSHA state. Well, actually we are in a way. Florida Fire OSHA is an actual separate rule within the state of Florida that they adopted that basically said all fire departments in the state of Florida have to follow OSHA regulations, basically. And there's another one too, is Florida is not an OSHA state, but we're an EPA state, meaning we follow the EPA regulations. Well, EPA regulations in regards to confined space and confined space emergencies are identical to 1910-146. So really there's no way around it. We have to be in compliance with this rule, OSHA 1910-146. Requires employers to provide confined space rescue in their confined space action plan, provides two options for rescue services, on-site personnel and off-site rescue personnel. And this is the rule, it pertains to both private sector and public sector, both, because Florida adopted it for us as firefighters, and also the private sector all has to follow OSHA. So if you work for Verizon, you're under OSHA rules. If you work for FP&L, you're under OSHA rules. So if you're a private contractor doing, let's say, lift station maintenance for Manatee County government, you have to comply with OSHA rules. So what OSHA rules means is that they have to provide, they can have personnel on site that when they're doing a confined space entry to provide rescue services or off-site rescue services. And most people, when they're doing what they mean by off-site is they're going to go ahead and fill out their permit, and on their permit they're going to put West Manatee Fire Rescue is my off-site rescue service. They don't have to tell us that, but that's what they may do, is they may plug us in as their rescue service in the event that they're doing a confined space entry. Confined space operations are regulated by 1910. We said that requires employers whose personnel may be called upon to respond to emergencies involving confined space to be trained to at least the awareness level, which is what we're doing now, at the initial assignment of duties and each year thereafter. And I will be honest, we've been delinquent with that, and hopefully going forward we'll make sure that we make this a regular thing. Confined space, when engaging confined space operating, employers shall ensure that at least one standby person at the site is trained and immediately available to perform rescue and emergency services. So, at site and immediately available is defined as able to respond to an incident within 4 to 6 minutes. What that means is, okay, I'm a Verizon contractor. I'm going to have to do some work down in a manhole that's greater than 5 feet deep. We got to splice some wires. We're going to be there for 3 or 4 hours. So I got to get my fan, I got to have my ladder, I got to have my means of egress, I got to fill out my entry permit, and then the site is safe. There's no atmospheric hazards other than possibly deficient O2. I have to make sure that I either have somebody above the hole outside that can respond to an incident, or I can list the fire department that's available within 4 to 6 minutes of notification to come rescue me. It wouldn't surprise me. In my career, I've seen it where we responded to a situation where somebody thought somebody was in trouble, and it was late at night, and it's a Verizon guy down in the hole, sitting there on a little box, splicing wires with just a ladder down there by himself. I've seen that happen before. So it's not something that you may never see. Confined space is a space that is large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter the space and perform work, has limited or restricted means of entry. In other words, it's the opening to get into the space is limited and restricted, and but at least you can enter it. It is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. Here's some examples of confined space. Here's some examples of confined space: tanks, sewers, like I said earlier. Possibly electrical vaults, manholes, silos. Maybe out east you'd find some silos and bins, tank cars, probably Tropicana area, any storage tank, in pits, things like that. Okay, the hazards that can be contained within confined space. We have two types of hazards that you potentially would see in confined space. First would be atmospheric hazards, and the second would be physical hazards. And we're going to move on and talk about each one separately. Okay, within atmospheric hazards, we have 4 types of hazards. We have oxygen deficient environment, we have oxygen displaced, combustibility, flammability, and we have toxicity. So these are 4 types of atmospheric hazards that can occur within a confined space. Next, moving on. Let's talk first about oxygen deficiency. What that is the consumption of oxygen takes place during some type of open flame operation, such as cutting and welding. In those 2 situations, South Carolina and Iowa, that's exactly what it was. Is they entered a space, started doing work using torches, and they depleted the atmosphere of oxygen, and they went unconscious. Can also be present in manholes near garbage dumps, landfills, and swampy areas where fermentation has caused the consumption of oxygen. So you have the breakdown of organic material, which utilizes oxygen, and then would create an oxygen deficient atmosphere. So that's a problem also. Oxygen displacement is our second item, and that is gas. Some other gas will push or displace oxygen out of the confined space. Nitrogen is a good example. It's covered in the ROG, and what they do is they use the nitrogen to purge the tanks. Entering the tank before the nitrogen is removed and properly vented meaning providing fresh oxygen in the space, can prove fatal in minutes. And the normal oxygen percentage in air is 20.9%. An oxygen, or the atmosphere, is considered oxygen deficient when it is 19% or less. When it drops below 19.5% or less, it's considered deficient. Within the ROG, it has different levels of oxygen deficiency below 19.5, and what your how you would feel in regards to those. When you become unconscious, when you start to get a little drowsy, that kind of thing. That's contained within the ROG. Then we're going to go to the third atmosphere, is a flammable atmosphere. Some confined spaces contain solvents, fuel, gasoline, kerosene, which provides fuel for combustion. Now remember, these tanks may be empty of solvents, fuel, gasoline, or what have you, but the vapors may still exist. So when you arrive on scene, one of the most important things you can do when you're doing your size up is determine, okay, where are the workers? They're in such and such a tank. What was the tank previously used for? Hopefully they drain the tank completely of these types of items to get rid of the flammability, but in some cases they may have drained the fuel out of it, or the solvent or the liquid, but they may still have the vapors left, residual. So So that's something you need to be concerned about. For an atmosphere to become flammable, there must be fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source present, and that's basic fire science, fire tetrahedron, fire triangle. So flammable atmospheres. Your flammable atmosphere is concentrations of a gas below the LEL, which are too lean to burn, and then concentrations of gas above the upper LEL, which are too rich to burn. The danger area is in the middle here, is the danger area. So that's one thing we have. That's why we have our gas detectors, is we want to get our gas detector out. We want to do an air sample of the space to make sure that is not in the danger area. If it is, we want to ventilate. Okay, the next item is the fourth item as far as the atmospheric hazards associated with confined space is toxicity. Okay, toxic gases can accumulate in the form of chemical, biological, and any maintenance activities and decomposition. Chemicals used in the production process, we just talked about that. If the tank was being used for some kind of solvent or what have you. And then biological, not only is the chemical could be flammable, the chemical could be toxic also. A good example would be hydrogen not hydrogen, excuse me, sorry about that. Hydrogen sulfide, which is both flammable and toxic. Then biological chemical breakdown of a product, which you'd find in the sewer systems, and then maintenance activities, residual from welding, and then decomposition. These are all toxic hazards. Okay, I'm sorry, hydrogen sulfide is what I meant. It's a sewer gas, it's colorless, rotten egg smell, causes loss of smell with exposure, inhibits exchange of oxygen at cellular level. It's a chemical asphyxiant, heavier than air, vapor density is above 1, which makes it heavier than air. It's flammable at concentrations of 4.3 to 45%, and I'm not sure. Yes. Okay, moving on. Then we have carbon monoxide. Now these two gases, hydrogen sulfide and carbon monoxide, should be able to be measured in your gas detectors. Most agencies carry a multi-gas detector. Ours are 4 gas detectors: oxygen, flammability, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless gas formed by incomplete combustion, inhibits the body's ability to transport oxygen, combines with blood cells more easily than oxygen, eventually displacing oxygen. We learned all this about carbon monoxide in regards to our basic firefighting. Then methane gas is another gas. It's odorless, generated by organic decomposition, natural gas leaks. This is an asphyxiant, displaces or dilutes the oxygen. And then it's thinner than air, vapor density below 1, making it lighter than air, flammable at concentrations of between 5 and 10%. And then we're moving on. And then we have common solvents. Okay, the vapors produced by the solvent may cause central nervous dysfunction, central nervous damage if inhaled in sufficient quantities. Inhalation can cause dizziness, drowsiness, and loss of consciousness, and eventually death. So solvents are very important to know about. Okay. Moving on. Okay, now we're moving into the next thing. We just covered the atmospheric hazards. Now we're covering the actual physical hazards. The physical hazards can be considered as hazards that cause the body to become stressed. Unlike atmospheric hazards, physical hazards can be detected through the senses, which would be sight and touch. Any questions so far before we move on? Okay, everybody's been great. No questions. Engulfment. These are physical hazards. The first one would be engulfment. Engulfment and suffocation are hazards. Let me go back here. Engulfment and suffocation are hazards with loose material stored in a bin or container. Bridging can occur and cause sudden collapse of material that can engulf workers and rescuers. So you become engulfed with the material that is contained in a bin or a container or the space that you're in. Other hazards that must be considered are moving and rotating equipment, electrical energy, hot and cold conditions, wet slick surfaces, and excessive noise. Moving and rotating equipment. That could be on an industrial site. Another place that you would see moving and rotating equipment would be a wet pit well on a sewer system. You have two types of wells. You have a wet pit, dry pit. Typically, the wet pits, generally they have a platform of pumps that are on tracks. And then what happens is that when they're moving the effluent, they have these pumps submersible. They're submerged down at the bottom of the pit, and the effluent comes in, and the pumps ship it whatever direction it needs to go back to the treatment plant. And when they do maintenance on these, they generally crank these things up on electric motors, and it brings the pumping equipment up to the top. They do their maintenance. They don't have to go down in the hole, and then they send it right back down when they're done doing their maintenance. That would be considered moving and rotating equipment that you would find within a confined space. Then you have the dry pits, which basically the deep pit, and the pumps you have to climb a ladder to get down to the bottom of the hole. They range anywhere from 10 to 20 foot deep, and the only way to get in there is a little man ladder or ship ladder, and they have pumps at the bottom of the pit, and they do maintenance there. That also is considered a confined space, and there is moving and rotating equipment and also electrical energized equipment. Hot and cold conditions, in our case, hot conditions. Where I would be concerned about hot conditions in our situation would be in the heat of the summer. If you go to an industrial facility and they're doing tank maintenance work and guys are inside a tank doing some stuff, you have the sun beating down on a hot tank. Those temperatures are going to be a lot higher than the ambient air temperature outside of that tank, depending on what type of tank. If it's a steel tank, obviously just picture what it would feel like inside of a steel tank in the middle of the day in summer. Wet and slick surfaces, and then excessive noise. Okay, moving on from the physical hazards, recognizing confined spaces. In order for a work area to be considered a confined space, it must meet all three of the following criteria. It has to contain limited openings, not intended for continuous human occupancy, and the space is large enough to enter and work inside the space. Okay, so those areas are considered confined space. Limited entry and exit openings. Confined space is generally difficult to enter into and work in. In the event of emergency, rescue of an incapacitated victim becomes even more challenging. Very difficult. If your entry space is very limited to get into, it makes it harder to get your victim out, especially if they are injured. If you have a person in a 20-foot hole and you're in a manhole, the size of a manhole, and he has some kind of a spinal cord injury, and you have to package this guy and put him in a sked or put him in an immobilization device, and you got to package him and you got to lift him out of the hole. It can be very complicated. One thing I will say about confined space rescue, if we do have to do entry and we do have to do rescue, it is a very time-consuming process. It's something that doesn't happen quickly. It takes time to get set up. It takes time to get all the people in place, all the equipment in place before we even start performing your rescue. Even if there are more than one means of entry or egress, their physical configuration may make the space a confined space. We'll talk about stuff you typically wouldn't find. They had a situation, I think it was last month, where some guy abducted a little kid and brought him to his shelter in his backyard or somewhere, and he just had one little, they said 4 or 6 inch pipe that went down into a hole, and there was limited means of entry or access. So here we have a militia guy who created his own confined space. So that's something that you have to think of, especially these people that are the doomsdayers or the Armageddons or whatever they are. They got TV shows about them, how to build your place to stay safe. Those technically we could consider as a confined space. Not a permitted confined space, but a non-permitted confined space. Simply put, the space was created or designed to hold something other than human beings, is the definition of a confined space. Large enough to work inside. If you cannot fit your body inside the space, you cannot become trapped or incapacitated within that space. According to OSHA, if a space does not meet all of these 3 criteria, then it's not considered a confined space. That's according to OSHA. But we work and we may define something as a confined space. In other words, if we get on scene and there's been a collapse of a structure of some sort, and people are trapped within a tight confined area with limited entry or access, but it wasn't really officially a confined space, we may determine that it is considered a non-permitted confined space. We have two types of confined spaces. We have permitted, and then we have non-permitted confined spaces. Permit confined space are the most dangerous and require those entering to complete a safety checklist or permit prior to entering the space. On MCRG 17, in the very back 2 pages, is our permit that we would use in the event that we had to make an entry into a permitted required confined space. And actually, it's a checklist that we would use anytime we're going to do any type of confined space entry. Okay, so in the back of MCRG 17, actually, let me go to that right now, and then we'll just jump down to it. And while I'm jumping down, it's on the last page. Anybody have any questions? Okay, go back up. All right, this is on page 17. I've already highlighted it, but basically, this is the front page. It talks about the number of victims, and then are we doing a rescue or recovery? A lot of situations, we more than likely would be doing a recovery, not necessarily a rescue. Because of the circumstances surrounding the time it takes us to get there and do stuff, and how long they've been in there, and what were the hazards, especially if it's an atmospheric hazard, and then the potential hazards, the communications method. Hopefully, and I'm not 100% positive, but I'm sure the USAR team has communications, and typically you want your communications to be hands-free. Remote testing. This is the remote testing that needs to be accomplished: O2, LEL, CO, hydrogen sulfide, and then sulfur dioxide, and then anything other. And then these are the parts per million. And this is all contained within the permit. So it's like a job aid for you to use when you get out and you're going to work in a confined space environment. This is a job aid that we would use and fill out on any time that we made. Who the entrants were, time in, time out, what safety equipment were utilized, and then atmospheric monitoring that was taking place. So that is our MCRG. We'll go back to the slideshow. There we go. And give me a second here. Okay, I see you can see the slideshow again. Hold on, I just blanked it out. Bear with me here. Now I'm going to get the slideshow. It'll take me a second here. I got a little technical problem. Okay, we're back, and I'm gonna have to go through it because I lost that screen. We'll go back to the permit thing. This is relatively new to us, this system, so we're learning it. There we are. Moving on. Okay. I believe we were here. We might have covered this. Okay. Confined space review the following: purpose of entry, time spent inside the confined space, qualified entry team and attendance, atmospheric conditions, communication, safety, and equipment used, and any hazards eliminated, especially ventilation. All right. Okay, permits should be kept outside the confined space with the attendant or a supervisor. Once work is completed, the permit is canceled and filed properly. A permit is required. A permit required confined space is a space that one or more of the following characteristics: contains or could contain a hazardous atmosphere, contains material that could engulf a person. So we have hazardous atmosphere, engulfment problem, has inwardly converging walls or floors that slopes downward, and taper to a small cross section. You'll find this if you ever looked at a manhole cover at the bottom of them, they'll have the pipes coming in from the different drain areas, and the floor at the bottom will be sloped. That way it directs the effluent to go in a certain direction. So take a look, pull them in, or get with the county or the public utilities and see. Get with the public utilities and see if you can have one opened up and have them show you the inside of the bottom of a manhole. Contains any other recognized serious hazards. Permit required examples would be gasoline, oil, and solvents, sewers and manholes, grain bins, hoppers. Non-permit spaces, at least dangerous, are the least dangerous and do not require those entering to complete a safety checklist. But like I said before, if you're going to enter let's say a collapse environment, or somebody mentioned yesterday about the guy that was in the sinkhole, would that be considered confined space? Maybe, it depends. But anyway, if you have the checklist available, it doesn't hurt to get it out to make sure, or permit prior to entering the space. It doesn't hurt to get it out to make sure that some of these components are taking place. One thing we cannot do is, as an engine company, if you go into a situation, and let's take that Verizon worker, and he's in a 10-foot deep hole working on some wires, and he becomes incapacitated, and we show up on scene. About all we can do for him is put a ladder down the hole, and hopefully he's conscious enough to know the ladder's there. If he doesn't already have a ladder there, more than likely he already has a ladder in the hole. Hopefully he'll have a rope tied to him, or had a harness on in the rope, and we can haul him up. But beyond that, there's really not much that we can do, because that's a permitted confined space. We have to wait for the proper equipment and the properly trained personnel, operations level personnel, to show up scene to effect a rescue. Non-permit required confined space does not and could not contain hazards that could cause death or serious harm. That's the difference. The militia guy that digs the hole in his backyard, that would be an example of a non-permit confined space. You show up on scene, he had a roof collapse, and maybe there's unlimited means of egress and entry and egress that he created, then that would be considered a non-permitted confined space. Non-permit examples: equipment closets, crawl spaces under homes, which can be rather tight, machinery cabinets, ventilated tunnels. And I'll give you an example of a drop ceiling. Non-permit example. Some lift stations are so big that they have a regular set of stairs with railings, and they may go down 20, 25 feet deep, and they might have a flight of stairs with a landing, and then another flight of stairs. They may have one straight shot of stairs, but they actually have stairs, and it's not a man ladder to get into. And then it's a big wide open space with a bunch of big pumps in it, and they have it ventilated, they have lights in it, they have everything in it. That technically, and it's a regular doorway to enter, that technically could be considered a non-permitted example of a confined space. Emergency rescue procedures. Confined space accidents are rare, but are usually fatal when they occur. Two major factors lead to fatalities, and we'll be showing a video in regards to this in a minute. It's failure to recognize and control hazards associated within the confined space, and inadequate or incorrect emergency response or rescue attempt. Controlling the hazards. One thing we can do if we have the equipment is we can ventilate a hole without making entry, but you have to have the proper equipment. You cannot have a gasoline-powered fan to ventilate a hole, because you're going to be basically introducing carbon monoxide into the space. So you need electric-powered fans. We at West Manatee carry an electric-powered fan on our ladder truck. The old smoke ejectors are electric-powered. Those would work well. Typically, you can get the tubing that goes on them, and you want to put the tubing at the bottom of the hole to force the air out, to make the air, to bring the air up to normal environmental conditions of 19.5% or greater. Inadequate or incorrect emergency response for the rescue attempt. The video will go over all of that. We'll show a video, 10-minute video, and it'll go over all of that. Never enter a confined space to rescue someone without proper equipment and an action plan. I know we don't carry the proper equipment to enter a confined space here to effect a rescue. Spontaneous rescue attempts in the heat of the moment usually lead to multiple fatalities. Typically, fire department personnel are trained only to the awareness space level only. Now, the exception is USAR people, or people that have taken classes specific to confined space rescue and are authorized to perform confined space rescue, and they have the proper equipment. Okay, firefighters trained to the operational level possess the proper training and or safety equipment to perform confined space rescues. And that requires annually, I believe it's 8 hours of training annually in order to stay current at the operational level for confined space emergencies or confined space rescues. And you have to have the proper equipment to do it, which is air monitoring equipment, ventilating equipment, the ropes, which we do carry the ropes, and we do carry the pulleys, and we can create some kind of A-frame system to do a haul system. We don't really have adequate communications. I mean, we can use portable radios, but it gets very difficult and prefer to be hands-free. USAR personnel and equipment will be dispatched. What I've been told is USAR personnel and equipment will be dispatched to all confirmed confined space emergencies in our county going forward. Safety equipment. You want to make sure you employ the ICS system. You want to always have a safety officer. You want to follow our standard operating procedures, which are MCRRG number 17. And then you want to have toxic or combustible gas detection equipment. We have a problem. We have multi-gas detectors, but we don't have sampling tubes or sampling pumps where we can put a probe deep down into a hole or a pit or a well or a tank and take air samples. You just can't take air samples at the top of the tank. You have to take air samples at all levels of within the actual confined space. So we have gas detection equipment, but we do not have the sampling equipment. And self-contained breathing apparatus. Now, the USAR has supplied air breathing apparatus. The difference between supplied air and self-contained is on self-contained breathing apparatus is a regular Scott pack or MSA that you have strapped on your back. Makes it very difficult to enter a hole with that on your back because you have limited space and maneuverability. Whereas a supplied air breathing apparatus, or otherwise known as a SAVA system, is a mask with hoses that come out, and somebody up top on the surface is monitoring your air supply. Plus, there's a backup, and there's redundancy, and you have longer periods of time. You have continuous air supply is what you have based on what's on scene. And then you also have a 5-minute escape bottle. So that's the difference between what we carry and what the USAR guys would carry when they're doing a confined space. So that's one of the reasons why we really don't want to enter into a confined space utilizing our self-contained breathing apparatus. And like I said, it's not a quick thing. Okay, in summary, the things that we can do in the event of a confined space emergency is we have our ladder. If the guy is not incapacitated and maybe lost his means of egress, we could throw a ladder down the hole. We could throw a rope down the hole. Hopefully the guy had a harness on and he was already attached to rope. We can haul him up. We can ventilate the hole. So these are things we can do without entering the hole to try to effect a rescue. They may just be stuck. You know, who knows what the circumstances were. But anyway, so now let's go ahead and run a video, and I'm going to run this video, which is let me bear with me. Setting up the video right now. Somehow it got lost in the shuffle. It should play. Let's see if it's going to play for you. And I'm going to start the video. Let's see what happens here. Okay, the video is playing, and I'm going to go ahead and mute my sound.
There was something wrong, and I knew it. And I didn't know what it was. It's dark, it's wet, it's eerie. You know, you climb down this ladder and I get to the bottom and now I'm consumed in death. And I yelled for help and I couldn't. I could not make it on my own. And that's a hard thing for a human to admit, that I could not save my father. I couldn't do it. We worked that morning just setting up the tools, getting a welder out, and kind of figuring out what we wanted to do that day. It took almost until the sun came up, which was right around, oh, I don't know, 7:30 probably. We had a coffee break. It was actually a pretty good day. My father, it was actually in a really good mood that night.
Yes.
Some of these hats just to see where we're at.
All right, well, I'll check in with the boys.
Hey, do me a favor, will you? Ask Marco if those parts are ready and then bring them on down here.